Welcome to a Monday. We made it, another work week. It is October 15th. I am thrilled to be your host, Diane Gatsis Havinga. And I think most of you remembered a few weeks ago, I guess it's been about a month, we did a program with my two guests, and the response was so positive. And people said, well, you didn't really touch a lot on the 68 protests and activism, and so we decided, let's go ahead and bring them both back on and expand that program. So I'm delighted to have Elke Martin once again join with John Carle joining us, and again, kind of rewinding a little bit. You know, we talked about the musical Hair 50 years ago. John was really giving us lots of information about hair, and then Elke came on to talk about protests.
That's right. That's what we called it in those days.
Because 50 years ago, they were protests.
Absolutely.
And now they're called activism, and I'm not sure why. Do you know why?
Well, I think it's like in every other area in life that every generation has their own language. I was just talking to young people yesterday at a different activist event, and they are in their 20s, and we had to spend a good 10 minutes just on clarifying what we were talking. Were we talking about the same thing? And you know, the vocabulary just changes over time.
Also, I think activism is much more inclusive to peaceful versus not so peaceful. Whereas protest, I mean, has that connotation.
That it's more negative, you think?
Yeah, I think it is.
Oh, I don't think it was negative in 68 necessarily.
No, but
because I mean, at least where I come from, we were always non-violent and focused on, you know, just being out on the street.
But people would not refer to you as an activist. They might say you attended a sit-in or something like that. It was gentler language. Protesting is really rather strong.
And when you mention sit-ins, that brings me way back, because I don't. Do they say sit-ins? Do they do sit-ins anymore? I don't know. I mean,
I don't know either. I haven't heard it in a long time.
Yeah, I mean, it's like.
And I haven't seen the images either that used to. Well, weren't people sitting on the street recently blockading something?
But they didn't call it a.
But it's not a sit-in anymore.
It was,
no,
so
that's generational.
Well, let's kind of again reverse or go back, right? Go back in terms of, and I know we touched on this when we did the show a few weeks ago in terms of what protests were and how we all got started, but. I'm going to say both of you started your activism sooner than I, because I was just on the fringe of the Vietnam protests back then. I was in high school. You know, I wasn't marching back then. My big claim to fame was that I wore a armband, black armband, to signify my protests of the Vietnam War, and a black button, and I wore that to school, and I think shock is probably the right word when my mother fully supported that. I wasn't sure, you know, but she, you know, she supported that, and that was about it for me, because my generation was the first generation that didn't have to deal with the draft. You know, that had ended by then. And, you know, my class wasn't going off to fight. But my sisters and their boyfriends, you know, they had to deal with the draft and their numbers. And, you know, I had teachers who, you know, and I think you, of course, Elke, you weren't here in the country, but and John, you were beyond high school, but there were teachers, male teachers, who went into teaching to avoid being drafted, because back then, remember, folks, male teachers were in demand, and
I was teaching at that point.
So you were able,
Yes, and my fourth year in teaching, when I decided to leave that profession, I immediately was hit with the draft possibility, and I had a choice: sit it out and keep my fingers crossed, because we had the lottery at that point, the draft lottery, or become a draft dodger, moved to Canada, that type of thing was very prevalent. And I was lucky I missed it by one whole block of numbers.
In terms of the lottery, so you
Yeah,
had
I think
kind
they
of
did it like 100 at a time, and I was in the next 100 when it stopped, when
Right.
it was over.
right.
So
And I know
was lucky.
similar men who had the same, are they going to, what are they going to do? One was applied for conscientious objector. Some had low numbers and they were really sweating it out. And some,
Right.
if you had that high number, I think it was over 200 maybe
Right.
back then, you were kind of safe, But yeah, so I still was familiar with all that. Obviously, I watched it on TV like everyone else, but I didn't really become active, to use the modern terms, until I was much older. So let's go to Elke. So Elke's, of course, she's in Germany during this time.
And she is in the last year of high school. But what I had learned at some point during my last few years in high school is that I was president of the student body, and so I had learned then that every voice counts, and it makes a difference whether you sit at home or engage somehow. And the student movement in Europe was very strong. In Germany, it started actually in '67 with the visit of the Shah of Iran.
Oh yes,
Where
talk
we had
about-
lots of protests, and one of the students was shot to death by the police, and that generated its own momentum and anger and fueled further protests. And then that led into the anti-Vietnam protests. And then we, meaning the young women at the time, as we were engaged in the debates, and some of us were walking in non-violent demonstrations on the streets, we realized that, yes, we wanted a different world and we wanted a better world, but somehow it was still a world where the guys got to do all the important things, and the guys got to speak, and the guys were in the and that didn't seem right. And since we were in the midst of changing the world, of course we wanted to change that too. And then around 1970, we heard from and about the women's movement in the US and followed that.
So right.
So it one led directly into the other.
Right, the women's movement really took hold during 1968.
Yes.
The black rights or black protests were very prevalent, and that whole, again, started to take off. And I also think that the gay rights movement really started that whole, so it was
Stonewall
just,
69, right?
Yes.
Which was the big kickoff
right, so
in this country, yeah.
it just
And
kind
if
of,
you saw the RBG movie that's been popular recently,
Right.
she talked about how that 68 was her big aha to focus on, taking cases and changing the law so that women would become equal citizens.
right.
An interesting thing when you mentioned the gay rights movement, before Stonewall, the gay rights movement was basically, hey, I'm gay and I have the same rights and I'm the same as you are. The only difference between you and me is our sexual preference of who we love. But in '69, with the Stonewall riots, it became more of a pride movement of I am different and I'm proud of that difference. And so it took a slightly different turn.
But when you say that, really before '68, people were in the U.S. were out and open and going around saying, "Hey."
Those who were.
Yeah, but there were very
few.
very few.
But
I think
they were not interested in being different. They wanted
correct.
to be.
Yeah, I get it.
They
I
wanted to be
understand.
assimilated.
I understand. Yeah. Well, that's a phase every movement goes through, right?
Yes.
To be accepted. Yeah.
And it really, if you think about it again, so that was 50 years ago, and again, if we flash forward to today, these movements are still kind
necessary.
of, well, that's a great word, necessary, but I was going to say kind of front and center. I mean, except that I think it's also almost accepted. You know, if you look at the gay rights movement, the younger generation have no, thought about, oh yeah, I'm gay. Whereas sometimes I'm still taken aback that they would be so open to say that to me, especially when they don't really know me, but they're very comfortable. Whereas, again, growing up 15 years ago, you had to be careful what you said.
That's exactly
Well, the
right.
debate has certainly changed, and the different focal points have changed coming out of the movement. But let's not forget, we live in Virginia. You can still get fired for being gay. You can still lose housing if you're in public housing for being gay. That's why the first word out of my mouth about this movement is it's still necessary.
I didn't realize that was still the
Right,
case.
you don't have to.
Right.
Yeah.
Another idea that just came to my mind while you were talking about that is we really should have a profession called activism, where we can study it and say, okay, I'm going to be an activist. And we can just say, okay, well, so what's our next war going to be? So we can prepare to protest it.
I don't know. What do you think
And
of
who's
that?
going to finance that?
Well, why not? I mean, who finances protest movements now?
Oh, they are heavily underfinanced, unless you protest for something that some industry is in favor of.
Well, aren't they? Wouldn't they be in favor
You
of
really
war?
mean a war? So
Yeah.
yeah, well, of course.
I mean, we just seem to go from one to the other, so why not have a permanent protest group?
That's a typical John comment.
Okay, let's go on to our next. But let's again go back to 1968.
Yeah.
So we'll have John. I'll have you first. So I know you said you were arrested,
Yes.
and that was your first or only time, or
First and only.
okay. So
I learned quickly.
not to get arrested. Yes, and I will say I've never been arrested, nor will I think I would want to get arrested for a variety of reasons. But I've never had even come close to having that possibility. So I've been really lucky, I'm thinking, on that end, because most of the demonstrations that I've participated in have really been quite peaceful. There have been some that have been a little scary, where we all went, you know what? We're not going to stand here, because if we stand here, we're trapped. We have no exit. And the group that I was with collectively said, let's move to another area and get away from this whole aspect of we're trapped if something did come up, because there was always that possibility that it could, who knew, in terms of people who weren't supportive of the march would decide to turn it into something else. So I've been conscious of that, but in terms of the police force feeling that threatened, I've never had that experience. So when that happened to you, what was your
Well, I didn't believe it was happening at the time. I mean, because we were protesting down around City Hall in Manhattan, in New York, and I can't even remember the name of the group that I was with, but it was very peaceful, sitting on the ground, and just, I guess, our proximity to City Hall led to some concern or an excuse. And a whole bunch of us who were sitting were just rounded up and hustled off into paddy wagons. I love that term, paddy wagon. Padlocks on the door.
And then you were processed and
Oh,
jailed,
yeah.
or how long
Yeah.
did you spend in
Overnight.
jail? And so it was overnight. There
And I
was-
must say they kept us away from the general population, which if they...
General prison population.
Yes.
Yeah, good.
Yes, I'm in jail now. And so that was a kindness that, if they really wanted to, be extremely mean, they could have thrown us in with the general population, which would not have been an interesting evening. But it was, slop for food.
And you were in a big common jail
Yeah.
cell, so it wasn't
Yeah.
just you, it was you
No.
with the people you were arrested
Right.
with. So at least you
Yeah.
kind of knew who they were, I guess.
And
that's-
I don't know what the process was as far as what happened on the outside, because this group had legal representation, so things were going on the outside that I knew nothing about. I was just a kid, Well, I was older than a kid. This was 1964. So that would have been just at the midpoint. The Vietnamese War started in 55. So this was like almost 10 years into the war, and it still was going to go another 10 years. So that was my time there. And of course, John being John, said, well, if I have this on my record, does that mean I don't have to go into the Army? I figured because going into the Army was like an honor and a wonderful thing. Do I want to get blown up over there? Well, sure, I'll go, So you just sort of wonder about things like that. Well, if it's such an honor, why are you sending me? I'm a jailbird.
So that, of course, you never got to test that theory.
No,
so.
I never did. And I don't think, I think it was cleared, the record was cleared.
And of course, Elke, you had a totally different experience when you were arrested in Germany.
That's correct. I have several memories. When I was really young and arrested in Germany, it was because of our protests against nuclear power plants, and not sufficiently researched in regards to safety, or maybe sufficiently researched and discarded. We didn't know that. But I was never arrested just by myself. Like John, I was arrested with a group, and then we were processed. And so I didn't even spend the whole night. And I didn't get any slop. I didn't get anything. That's not a complaint. And then I have another memory of protests early in Germany, and that's the scary part for me, because they meaning the police, tended to bring their German Shepherd dogs and chase us through the streets of Hamburg. And to this day, I'm very careful around dogs. I don't have anything against dogs, but it's really hard to get over that memory. That was pretty horrible. Because like you, I always sought out peaceful protests, and they only became not peaceful when the police arrived. So that was not a good thing. And then for a while, I got arrested a few times professionally, I guess, because I worked for Greenpeace. And, we had planned not on being arrested, but planned on certain actions. We would chain ourselves to something. I never climbed a smokestack. Greenpeace was famous for that. That wasn't me, for sure. But I was part of the group that, planned an action, did an action. And we expected to be arrested. And we didn't mind it so much because we wanted to get in the papers. And that's the way to do it. And, that was only always a question of hours, because a lot of the police force were on our side, putting the spotlight on the environment. And so everybody went through the motion, and then we went home. Yeah, I got arrested today. Oh. Kind of.
But it's sort of interesting how we all find our own ways in our own groups and our own generations of how to make noise, how to make excitement around what we're protesting for or against.
What we have a passion for.
Yeah.
And kind of piggybacking on that, one thing that it occurred to me was when I really started becoming, I guess, constantly active. I don't know if that's the right word I'm thinking of, but on a consistent basis over the last, if I think about it now, maybe 15, 20 years. And probably because now I'm in Washington, D.C., and obviously there's a lot of things. I mean, you could probably go to a march demonstration every day of the week in Washington, D.C., and the bigger ones, you know, are really advertised. And I would say the one that just comes to mind right now was the Moms March Against Guns, but it was like 20-some years ago, where we brought our kids. And there were kids in strollers, and we were all out, you know, it was a beautiful, I remember a beautiful day on the mall, and we were out to, you know, demonstrate and lend our voices. And like I said, I had at least I think 2 of my 3 kids with me. I'm not sure if my son came. And it's, since then, you know, my kids have always been kind of part of the demonstrations, from to the point where now they say, okay, are we going to do this? What, you know, can we do it? Oh, no, can't make it today. I got other things. But
but there was no element of fear around that moment.
No, and you know, some of them, you know, we would when we were, and I'm going to say protesting against the Iraq War. They weren't, you know, they weren't interested. You know, they had their own things, and you know, their father and I would go out, and we would, you know, do the protests, and I would always wave at the buildings because I knew I was being photographed, you know, and you know, counted. And I remember we would get signs. And what I always found was interesting is, you know, at the end of the day, we would go to whatever garage we happened to park in. And if it was a government garage, you could not take your signs inside that building. You had to leave the signs outside the building because it was government property and you weren't allowed to do that. Or if you went into the Smithsonian's to go to the bathroom, someone had to stay out with the signs because that was government property. And which was fine, you know.
Sure.
Well, talking about 68, I don't think we can forget to mention how tragic it was with the killing of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy. That certainly had an impact, you know, all through Western Europe.
And of course, the Democratic Convention, where there was, you know, the police just went after my term. I'm not. The demonstrations, of course, they wanted some. I think the demonstrators also wanted some publicity, and they got it full on television.
Yeah, and I found it interesting that the 60s, we talk about the 60s, and we don't necessarily mean 1960 to 69. It's generally referred to the 60s started really earnestly with the assassination of President Kennedy and ended with the Watergate in 1974. So that became the real, the cultural time frame of the 60s.
Right. So when you were in Germany and you are seeing all this happening.
Well, we saw some of it happening, you know. I'm not sure how much, I don't remember anything about the Democratic Convention, but certainly Martin Luther King Jr. stood for something, right? For an ideal and for ideas that were beyond this country. Same with Robert Kennedy. So that was so tragic and so, well, and it gave momentum to continue to fight for it, for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
It really took off in a huge way in Europe.
Yeah.
France, Germany.
Exactly.
And
yeah.
Great Britain.
And you know what they're talking about today is, you know, when, to me the big difference is with the social media and the aspect of the instant, as soon as something happens, regardless of whether it's a quote fact or not, it's there.
Right.
And you know, I'll be sitting home and my daughter will say, "Oh, and I go, "What?" And I look at my news feed, I'm like, well, I'm not seeing it in the Washington Post yet or NPR. I'm looking at what I consider more the established, but it's all, you know, on Instagram or wherever it is. And it has really taken off into giving us into, I think, a totally different direction.
Completely. Absolutely.
And I know, Elke, we mentioned earlier, you're still very active. You do, I would consider on a religious basis.
Oh.
You go down to the National Rifle Association, which
Every
again,
month, that's
every
correct.
month, and you have your sign and.
Yeah, and it's mostly carried by some local churches, and then some independent groups. But you know, it's my age group and older for the most part who can stand outside the NRA headquarters in the middle of the day, in the middle of the week. And we know that some things take time and they build over time, and some, I mean, oftentimes I would think you feel helpless as an individual against, you know, these big things that are happening, and you wonder, what can I do? And that's a little thing that I can do, and of course you don't really know how much of a difference it'll make, but it could. It could make some people think, whether they drive by in their car or look out of their office window, because it's not just once, it's every month now for 5 years. And you know, the group is growing, I can see that.
And it's really wonderful to participate that way, even though it may be just a small kernel here and there, because it gives you a sense of belonging to the larger community and helping. Because I do believe, although sometimes it's difficult, that we make 2 or 3 steps forward. We may take 1 or 2 back, but the general movement is forward, and I appreciate that. So, like with the Vietnam War was the first time that I separated, in my mind, the soldier from the war. You know, to me, so when I talk to Vietnam vets, especially when I was performing out in California, I was out there for a couple of months, and up in San Francisco, and there were just so many homeless vets on the streets, mainly because the weather is good for that. But talking to some of them, they would very often state how hurt they were because of how badly they were treated when they returned home. And I said, you know, that is the one thing, one good thing at least, besides all the profit, of course. But one good thing that came out of the Vietnam War is that people like me look at it and say, we don't blame you. You know, we're just thrilled you're home and safe. But what we do blame is our government for getting us into that and perpetuating and lying about it and keeping it going. So it was 2 separate issues, and I was very happy to realize that. Because how does something like war continue over thousands and thousands of years? I mean, to me, that's practically incomprehensible. That people would just throw lives and resources away like that. But that's me.
Elke, I'm going to have you have the last word. What would you want us to think about or remember about activism?
It's a good thing. Everybody, I think it's part of the responsibility in a society where you are a citizen and you are, or should be, happy and grateful that you're not in a dictatorship or, you know, some other form of government, but in a society where you have a voice, so use it and do whatever you can. Not everybody wants to be in a demonstration, not everybody can climb the smokestack, that's fine. You can find something. It starts with voting. I did that today because I am an election officer, so I have to vote beforehand, make sure that my vote gets in, and I know enough people who say, that doesn't make any difference. Well, it does. We see that every time the election results come in. So do that, and then think about what are you passionate about and what could you do. Little steps add up.
And I
There you have
will
it.
agree with you 100%. And I want to thank, again, Elke Martin, John Carle for sharing their memories and their thoughts about a topic that we could talk about forever and ever. And maybe we'll do it again.
Thanks, Diane.